Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics, and last week the EU Trade Commissioner Phil Hogan said that Boris Johnson's insistence on not extending the transition period beyond the end of 2020 was just a stunt, and that of course he's going to have to U-turn on that once negotiating realities become apparent. In this video, I'd like to discuss the merits of the argument ranged against the assumptions that he seems to be basing it on. But first, if you'd like to see more of my videos, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, to remind ourselves just what the transition period is intended to do, why it even exists. It exists to allow us to carry on with our normal lives and jobs whilst we work out a permanent agreement with the EU on everything from travel, security operation, goods and services, trade, that sort of thing. Which couldn't be done until after we'd left the EU, but we don't want to leave the EU and into nothing. We should also remember that the transition period was originally intended to last for nearly 2 years. It was negotiated at a time when we thought we'd be leaving at the end of March 2019, and then we would begin the negotiations shortly after that for the next phase of Brexit. That process was extended by 10 months, but the transition period has not been extended by a single day. And that original transition period would not have been enough time to conclude those talks if we had maintained all of those red lines that Theresa May insisted on and Boris Johnson seems to also be taking forward. So we're going to have we were going to have a transition period for negotiations lasting 21 months with a view to extending it if necessary. We are now moving under Boris Johnson to a position where we have 11 months, roughly half the time, to do the same thing with no view to extending at all. So it's easy to see why someone who actually understands international negotiations has taken part in them. It's easy to see how someone like that would see that as an untenable position. And of course an extension will be support. After all, how else are you going to get an agreement? It's particularly easy to imagine this if you are conscious of the fact that Boris Johnson knows nothing about what a comprehensive agreement involves and that he will realise within the next 6 months. Bear in mind, Boris Johnson has already conducted some negotiations with the EU in terms of his changes to the withdrawal agreement, and on more than one occasion he was caught out, because he had failed to understand a particular reality. But the problem, as I see it, is that Phil Hogan is applying logic and assuming that Boris Johnson wants a deal with the EU. Hogan knows that Britain needs a deal, but that's not how politics works. Let's make another assumption, or even a series of assumptions. Let's assume that Boris Johnson genuinely does want a deal with the EU. Let's also assume that he thinks he can get one that will still allow him to diverge from all EU standards in order to get his US trade deal, because the only way he'll get that, and that he thinks he can get it all in a year. Now, let's imagine that he thinks he played an absolute blinder with his last-minute withdrawal agreement, which was a much simpler document and had largely been written the year before anyway, but that he did it and he could somehow do it again at the last minute. Let us further suppose that there comes a point, whenever that may be this year, but there comes a point where Johnson finally realises that he has made a bad error and that if he fails to extend beyond the end of 2020, he will not get his EU deal and the UK will be plunged into the forewarned Brexit chaos in 2021. That's a lot of assumptions there. What can he really do about it? Can he go back to Parliament and say, hey, look guys, we don't have a deal ready and no deal sounds really scary. I think we should extend. Yeah, he'll be faced with the same daggers that May faced, and there are more of them now, because Parliament are much less likely to support an extension, even if he champions it, than the previous one would have. He has deliberately packed Parliament out with hardened loonies. He has taken legislative measures to make seeking an extension impossible for the government to do without major support in Parliament. Parliament would have to unpick legislation to allow him to do it. He'd be ousted by his own party and replaced with a more compliant leader. In other words, a leader who will actually follow what the ERG tells them to do. And although they say 24 hours is a long time in politics, so you can imagine what 6 months would be, and the political situation can definitely change significantly in that time. In fact, the political situation is very likely to change several times on a bit of a roller coaster in 2020, just like it did in 2019. This is one political journey that Boris Johnson surely cannot manage, even if he were willing, and that's a big if. But I also think it's a mistake to even imagine that he would be willing. Everything Johnson is doing suggests that he knows a deal is impossible and that he doesn't care. He sees these 11 months not as time to get a deal done. That's what he's saying, but I don't think he sees that. He sees it as 11 months to persuade the British public that the eventual failure to get a deal is not his fault. The blame game has already begun, and he isn't just blaming the EU this time. Never mind his New Year message asking for people all over the UK to come together and accept his offer of friendship. No. He's already started blaming the majority of us who want the UK to remain in the EU, and he's going to continue to do so. So although I accept that Boris Johnson probably is going to face a few rude awakenings this year, I don't really think it's going to change his direction of travel that much. And I think Mr. Hogan is going to certainly face a bit of a rude awakening when Boris Johnson accepts that there's not going to be a deal. He'll be thinking, right, so we need to extend then. Boris Johnson will just going, no, we won't be extending. Because ultimately politics trumps everything. And Boris Johnson doesn't necessarily want a deal. He doesn't want there to not be a deal. What he wants is to be Prime Minister, and he wants to continue to be Prime Minister. He likes power. And the only route to continued power is not to extend beyond the end of 2020, unless the political situation changed out of all predictability. So that's the reality of the situation, I fear. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.